Morning, folks. Welcome aboard another Electric Culture of Safety episode. We have Mr. Jimmy Vaughn here today. This is his second time here, and great guy. I consider Jimmy Vaughn the encyclopedia of line work. Honestly, great fella. Known him for 2 years now, and real quick, he's going to be talking about the alternative use of heavy equipment, man lifts, forklifts, and OSHA. So we're going to be discussing that here, listening to him. Tomorrow will be Miss Jen Miller. She's with OneSpan Powerline Services, and she's going to be talking about life on the wire, working around helicopters while performing line work. She'll be here tomorrow morning, about 9 o'clock, same time. And then next month, we've got Mr. Tony Boyd coming in with ISPC. ISPC, that's why Mr. Jimmy Vaughn is also here. They've been supporting ECOS. They bring about 4 to 5 speakers every single year to ECOS, and they're giving back, and they want to be part of this. So Mr. Tony Boyd will be coming in representing ISPC next month, and then Miss Pam Tompkins, she'll be also coming in next month, and she'll be discussing the heavyweight champion, employee in charge. So that'll be at the end of October. And if you want to register, just simply email safetytraining@bieremeters.com, and you'll be registered. Use your company email. We want to make sure everybody that's getting on is legit. We have now over 10,000 registered members to Electric Culture of Safety after a year and a half. So this is a real thing. This is something that we're doing to bring a line team together and discuss incidences, discuss rules, regulations, so we all come to the understanding of how we can work safely. And it's an incredible ride, and it's just such a blessing to be around all these folks sharing their expertise and all their knowledge of why and how we need to work safely. And so with that, Mr. Jimmy Vaughn, thank you, sir.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Brent.
Thank you.
And thank you, ECOS, and thank you, Bierer Meters, for sponsoring ECOS. I met Joe Bierer about a dozen years ago at an IP conference, and I was immediately impressed by his knowledge. And by the way, everything I know came from somebody else like Joe. And over the years, he's made himself available to me to help with knowledge and things I needed to know about meters and applications and work methods. And now that they're sponsoring ECOS, this is really a great opportunity for all of us to participate. And I encourage you to look forward to Jen Miller tomorrow. Da Vinci Sky OneSpan Line is one of our clients that we've been working with for a while. We've been really impressed with what they do. She'll give you some really good information about helicopters and line work if you're curious about that, so don't miss it. The alternative use of heavy equipment. Let me tell you what brings me to this title. One of the things that we do besides work methods, we do investigations, we do training, we develop training programs at ISPC, but I also do litigation support. So for the past 2 decades, I have been working as an expert witness in litigation, which is either OSHA and the employer, or sometimes civil and the employer, and sometimes civil and crews or supervisors or operators. And over the last few years, we've had some pretty common OSHA mistakes that they've made when they come onto job sites. And sometimes those mistakes were exacerbated because the people on the crew didn't understand the requirements of the OSHA standard and were unable to effectively defend themselves, and found themselves spending months in prosecution and sometimes having to go all the way to federal court in order to defend their actions and be found not guilty of violating the OSHA standards. So 2 of these have to do with fork-equipped front-end loaders, and the other is, and that includes forklifts on the job site, and the other is pin-on man baskets. So first, I want to do the forklift and loaders equipped with forks. So if you're not familiar with what we're talking about, especially in transmission work, out on the right-of-ways, very rough terrain, the perfect, and has been for 40 years or more, heavy front-end loaders equipped with forks used to move equipment. And sometimes it's pallets of equipment, and sometimes it's poles. But if you put a set of forks on a front end loader, it is not a forklift. It is a loader equipped with forks. And there's a very important distinction because it has a lot to do with how we run our jobs and what the requirements are for the operators of those pieces of equipment. Now, this is a forklift. That one on the right, that's a little warehouse forklift. And then the other two, those are job site all-terrain forklifts. What's unique about these forklifts is the way that they are built, the way that they are designed. They are 4 wheels with a steering set of wheels on an axle with one solid axle. The difference is that a loader is like this is an articulating loader that hinges in the center with hydraulics, and the front end swings back and forth. It is nowhere near what a forklift is, and there's a very distinct difference because of the licensing or the qualification of the operator. In all of labor, there are only 2 operator licenses that are required. One of those operator licenses is the forklift operator. And the forklift operator has to be licensed, which they can be licensed by the employer's own training program, but they have to be licensed to a specific criteria. In other words, they have to know information for a written test. The information they have to know is specified by OSHA. They have to demonstrate the use of the forklift. They have to demonstrate the inspection of the forklift. And they have to do that with a qualified inspector. And then once they've done that, they receive a license, which can be on the back of a business card. All it has to have is the name of the inspector that did the training, who did the inspection, the name of the person, and the model of the forklift that they are qualified to operate. And that's a requirement of the standard. Now that puts a certain responsibility also on the operator, because once you hold a license, you now have a responsibility to operate that forklift within the confines of the safety requirements of the OSHA standard and the employer's OSHA standard. The difference is that the other license is a crane operator. Those are the only 2 licensing requirements. The crane operator has to be licensed by a third party. They cannot be licensed by the employer. And that third party has to be certified and has to be approved by OSHA, having received their certification under a nationally recognized certifying agency. So that's where you get the idea of NCCCO and some of the others. I'm not advertising one over the other, but that's just an example that you're probably already familiar with. Now, the difference. Front end loaders, even if they are equipped with forks, are not forklifts. Now, I said that it's litigation that has brought me to these particular topics because on a number of occasions, OSHA has cited a contractor for having unlicensed operators operating loaders with forks. And because of the work that they were doing, they called that a serious violation of the forklift operator standard. And it's simply not true. Now, here's the hard part. I always hate to do this, but we have some rules in the OSHA standards, and the worst thing that you can do as a trainer is put a whole bunch of text on a board for a whole bunch of people to try to read. But the reason why I do this is because no matter how much I tell you that the rules are there, very few of you are actually going to go and read it, unless you are the people who are administering it. So we're going to touch on these rules. So the OSHA calls them PITs, powered industrial trucks. So first we're going to talk about the PIT standard and why it doesn't apply to these loaders equipped with forks. The very first rule, this section does not apply to compressed air or non-flammable compressed gas operated industrial trucks, nor to farm vehicles, nor to vehicles intended primarily for earth moving or overland hauling. So what is a front end loader designed for? It is designed and built to move earth. It's a earth moving piece of equipment. But we have found that because they can navigate very, very rough terrain with great efficiency, they have a lot of power, so they can lift heavy pieces of equipment and materials that we use in transmission construction. They are the perfect tool to operate on these right-of-ways, which is the reason why we've been using them. Then OSHA Rule A2, which immediately follows, I just read you A1, all new powered industrial trucks acquired and used by an employee shall meet the design construction requirements for powered industrial trucks established in the ANSI standard for powered industrial trucks, which is ANSI B56.1. And the very first paragraph in ANSI B56.1 says in scope that this standard covers forks or PITs except for vehicles intended primarily for earth moving and over-the-road handling. And the reason is because the standards that are created for forklifts cannot be met by a front-end loader, especially because of the way that it steers, that articulating loader. Now, when the forklift rules came out, stakeholders, employers, operators ask OSHA about the exception for these operators. And this was during what's known as, this is in the preamble. So if you are a safety administrator, knowing the OSHA rules is one thing. Reading the preamble is just as important, if not more important, than knowing the rules. Because it's the preamble that tells you what OSHA's intent was. The preamble includes all of the discussion by stakeholders, because when OSHA creates a new body of rules, the first thing that they do is they put out a notice of rulemaking, or what the proposed rules are going to be. Then the stakeholders, the ones who are going to be covered by the rule, will send questions to OSHA, and sometimes OSHA will have hearings around the country for rulemaking that's going to have a huge impact on an industry. And these stakeholders will come and they will ask OSHA questions, and OSHA will answer the questions about why the rule is the way that it's written and what it's supposed to cover. So there's a ton of information there that is valuable to you as the employer, as a supervisor, and even for foremen and supervisors to understand what it is that the rule intends. Because the rule itself, remember, is not necessarily tell you how to do something, it tells you what you have to accomplish. And that's an important distinction between those two. You find out what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to accomplish that by reading the preamble. So in the preamble, OSHA addressed rough terrain forklifts, and they wrote, and this is the bottom paragraph that you see on your screen, the definition excludes machines designed primarily for earth moving, such as loaders and dozers, even though their buckets and blades are replaced with forks, and machines designed primarily as over-the-road trucks equipped with lifting devices. These are not forklifts. And then finally, in the preamble, the direct question was answered. It says equipment that was designed to move earth but has been modified to accept forks is not covered by this rule. And what we have found is that local OSHA, and again, I always have to say this, I'm not criticizing OSHA. They have been an outstanding influence for safety in the industry. But you have to remember that OSHA, just like every other decision making, is made by people. They have an insistence on safety in the workplace, and sometimes they make the wrong decisions. So having people that know the rules, that can sit down in that first hearing with OSHA and say, look, you've cited wrong because of this, this, and this, is supposed to square away miscitations that OSHA makes. But sometimes they're human and they persist. And you have to know what your rights and what your rules are. And these statements like this should have an effect. So here's an important concept difference between the design between a forklift and a loader equipped with forks. If you've been in forklift training, one of the biggest emphasis that you have seen is what's known as the triangle of stability. The rear axle center point forms a triangle with the front two wheels. This creates the stable point in the very center of that triangle. And so you learn to envision the load as moving that center point. And because if you put a heavy load on the forks, that load moves toward the front axles. If it's lightly loaded, it moves toward the back. If I raise the mast up and tilt the mast back, then that center point moves back toward the back axle. But the operator is trained to keep that stability in the center of that triangle because that's what creates the stability of the lift. The two front rigid wheels on the rigid rear axle. The loader, on the other hand, is articulating at a center point. Now, if it's articulating at a center point, it's not designed anywhere near with the same kind of stability that a forklift has. So the whole design concept of the stability between the two means that that operator, who has to be qualified as an operator, understands how that loader equipped with forks is going to move and be operated, but is not required to meet those forklift standards because the two pieces of equipment are not alike at all. And like I said before, the reason why we have been using these loaders is because of that load capability and that terrain capability. The other thing that we have seen, and one of the citations that came about, was called load securement. Now, if you are a forklift operator, you know that you slide the forks underneath the pallet. The pallet is supposed to be stacked a certain way, and you're supposed to secure the load. And normally, we slide the load all the way back on the forks so that it lays against the backrest, and then we tilt it back slightly to help secure that load. And if we need to, we may strap or plastic wrap or something with that load so that the load won't fall off. That's important, especially if you're in a warehouse full of people, because people are always nearby when these forklifts are operating. On the other hand, if I've got a 6,000-pound pole sitting on the front forks, I don't tie it down. I'm going to tell you why in just a minute. So immediately the first thing that people say is, well, that's dangerous. A 6,000-pound, and usually there's 12 flat sides on most of these transmission poles. Some of them might be round concrete. They said it can roll or it can slide off of the forks. And so the answer to that is, so what? Watch this. If the pole falls off of the forks and hits nobody, OSHA doesn't care. It's that simple. I thought about writing a book about the simplicity of complying with OSHA, and I'm going to title it, Don't Swim with Piranhas. If piranhas will eat you when you're in the water, how do you prevent that? Don't swim with piranhas. Well, if a pole falling off of the forks will hit somebody, don't allow anybody to be in that space. So this has to do more with work planning and methods of work than anything else. And there's a good reason for that. Now, let's look at this. Here's our loader. Our pole falls off the loader. There is a hazard zone where that pole might go. Now, we're professional linemen. We know what the trajectory of hazard is when we're under a strain. We figure those all the time. We know where the wire is going if something breaks. We know where the rope's going. We know where the hoist is going. We stay out of that line of fire. Well, we do the same thing with a pole on the front of a forklift. If I put a pole on the front of the forklift, then my work procedures ought to say, this is where you stand, this is not where you stand. And if we have, and sometimes there's no great distance. Sometimes we pick it up off the back of the truck moves, we set it down, and it stays right there until the crane comes by, picks it up, and puts it in the ground. Other times, because of the terrain, our staking point may be some ways off of the terrain, and we may have to go some distance with that loader. That might include rocky areas or inclines or slopes. If we have a policy and we have a tailboard that says, okay, here's where we're picking it up, here's where we're going. If we lose the pole, this is where the pole's going. Just make sure you're not there. If it falls off, nobody gets hurt, no big deal. Now, the question is then, well, why don't we just tie it down? I have seen these, used on job sites. Now, this is called a timber carrier. Sometimes I have some other names for them. And I wrote on here, great for mills like timber mills, not so great for poles. See, if I'm carrying pieces of wood and I clamp down on that piece of wood, I can pick it up, I can turn around, and I can go where I want to with it. But what happens when we put a 30-foot long, 6,000-pound pole across the span of the forks and we clamp down on it? Well, remember the idea of the stability that we talked about? Look how this loader moves. The loader moves by articulating. And when the loader moves by articulating, look what happens to the dynamics of the loader stability when the pole weight is on there. If I articulate around to the side, you can see the angle across the square of my wheels has changed, and so has the support dynamics of the piece of equipment. So if I've got a 6,000-pound pole and I've got it strapped down to the loader, and I have some elevation on my load, maybe because of terrain or whatever, and if I start to lose, if the pole starts to rock, and it puts 6,000 pounds of sideways torque on that side of that loader, what do you think is going to happen? There's a good possibility the loader will turn over. So it may not be a good idea to clamp that loader. Of course, the other side of that is that if we're using the clamps, we also damage the galvanizing or the coating that's on the pole. That's another side issue. But the bigger of the issues is that if I clamp the pole down, I lose stability. So what it boils down to is this: your loader operator has to be qualified as a loader operator. They have to be trained in the dynamics of lifting a pole. You should have a policy for loading and unloading poles on your job site and the use of front load fork equipped loaders. The people on the ground should be aware of where they are supposed to be and where they shouldn't be when we're doing loading, and recognize that losing a pole is no big deal as long as nobody gets hurt. Now, you can choose to use the clamps if you want to, and if it's just a matter of pick the pole up, lowering the clamps, and we're not moving or going any great distance, and the terrain, is okay, there probably won't be any problem. But keep all of these things in mind when it comes to operating these loaders. Understand what the requirements are, and that loader operator is not a forklift operator. And if you keep those things clear in your mind, keep your policies clear, you'll be prepared when OSHA shows up on your job site. And by the way, we did have one case where OSHA, driving down an interstate highway, saw a construction project going on the side of the road and saw a loader that was carrying a 45-foot steel lower pole section. And he initiated an inspection because he saw that it wasn't tied down. And to him, that was a forklift and it was an unstable load. And so he initiated inspection. The crew and the foreman and the safety people on the job site that met with the OSHA guy had no idea how to defend themselves. And they spent months trying to get everybody clear on what the realities were and what was supposed to happen, and also educating that OSHA guy. But beyond OSHA, this is just some good tips about moving these poles around on these job sites. Okay, next topic. Pin-on man baskets. So this is the end of a 35-ton crane with a man basket attached on the end. We have used them forever. I've been in the industry now, Brent and I were just talking about it, over 50 years, and we were using pin-on man baskets on cranes then. So we've been using them for a long time. Now, OSHA didn't come around until after I was in the industry, and that's how long I've been doing it. I was here before OSHA. And OSHA established crane operations. When OSHA established crane operations, they made it a violation to hoist personnel with a crane. So I pin a basket on a crane, I violated an OSHA standard. Here's what the OSHA standard is. Don't get real excited yet, because That's called the, what do we call that? The snag or the grab or the hook. That's to get you interested. It's illegal to put a man basket on the end of a crane. It is. The rule says it begins, this is the first part of 1926 1431A. That rule is entitled Hoisting Personnel. And it says, the use of equipment to hoist personnel is prohibited. So that's the first thing that you ought to know. Most people, and I'm going to say that when I go out to utilities and we do training on work methods using baskets and man baskets on cranes, most of them do not know that that's a rule. That becomes important because OSHA does know that it's a rule. And sometimes when they've seen a construction site with a basket on a boom, and the one that I think of best was in Arizona, and the guy, OSHA guy's driving down I-10, and he looks over and he sees a guy, actually I think it was Utah, he sees a guy in a basket standing on the mid-rail so he can reach the top of a traveler, and he immediately pulls in. Because the guy's standing on the mid-rail. You can't do that. Got to have your feet on the floor of the basket. That's one of the requirements. Then he pulls up there. They start asking questions. The crew had no idea what the answers were, and OSHA shut them down for almost a week, which is a lot of lost time, because they said, can't you use a bucket truck? And the response says, well, it's easier with a crane. That's not how OSHA operates. Easier is not an exception. Now, incident prevention, most of you who are watching today are probably familiar with Incident Prevention Magazine. In the August-September of 2023 edition, I wrote an article in Train the Trainer 101, and the title is, The End of the Pin-on Man Basket, that explains this issue with the man basket. So let's start right at the beginning where read that article, because it goes into very much detail about why this is becoming an issue with pin-on man baskets, but we're going to talk about it here. I'm going to explain it. So that rule that says that lifting men is prohibited, or lifting workers or personnel is prohibited, goes on to say, except where the employer demonstrates that the erection, use, and dismantling of conventional means of reaching the work area, such as the personal hoist, ladder, stairway, aerial lift, elevating work platforms, or scaffold, would be more hazardous or is not possible because of the project structural design, and worksite conditions. This is the exception. Structural design, worksite conditions. Well, one of the worksite conditions is that for the longest time, there were few bucket trucks that would reach the top of a 200-foot pole. Well, that's starting to change too. So that could change the way that we do the work. So let's talk about these exceptions. Now, the evolution of pin-on man baskets, before it was a basket that was pinned on the end of the boom, and to OSHA, it doesn't matter whether it's suspended on a cable or pinned onto a boom, that's still hoisting personnel, and the rules still apply. But there are two bodies of consensus standards that regulate those two different methods of hoisting. So the first one is called the A92 standard. The A92 standard that you see on the top, that one's called the Vehicle Mounted Elevating, Rotating, and Aerial Devices. So this is, and when we say consensus standard, you probably already know, these are the rules like ANSI, ASTM, ASE, NFPA. These are groups of stakeholders in the industry that consider work methods, equipment, materials, and they help design the best practices associated with the work. OSHA recognizes that these are best practices, and OSHA uses these best practices sometimes as a guide for their own inspectors, and other times they adopt these consensus standards. When they adopt the consensus standards has the authority of law. So if OSHA adopts A92, then the A92 standard, the parts that say shall, are citable by OSHA. Well, OSHA still uses them in guidance, and they also use one that's called the B30 crane standard, and in particular ASME B3023 called personal lifting systems. Now here's the difference between the two. The A92 standard is the design criteria for man lifts, for bucket trucks, articulating, rotating. They are the standard for bucket trucks. The B30 standard is a standard for cranes, and the family of B30 standards includes what's known as B3023, the man baskets that pin onto cranes. The man basket B30 standard does not have the same safety component requirements that the A92 standard has for bucket trucks. So B30 cranes, and this is what OSHA's perspective is. Cranes lift stuff. Buckets lift people. So that's the way to remember. A92 for lifting people. B30 lifting stuff. The designs for A92 lifts are, and we say on the average, 5 times engineered for safety. More engineered for safety than a crane is. You know, the crane considers that we pick it up, we swing it around. If something breaks, the crane falls down, doesn't hit anybody, no big deal. You know, on the other hand, any bucket truck that comes down got people in the end of it. It's always going to hurt somebody. So the criteria for the protection of workers generally has a much higher safety standard than a mechanical standard or a rigging standard might have. And then A92 buckets have safety systems that are not required on cranes, such as elevation or balance setup so that you have a level balance, tension on the outriggers. There are a number of other sensing systems, and if you're a lineman that's been running a bucket, knows that sometimes your bucket shuts down in the middle of an operation because some safety system somewhere locked up and you couldn't go any farther because you had to back up in order to reset whatever the safety condition was that locked up the bucket. But here's been this is the basis for the exception. Remember we said that destruction or the structure or conditions. And what you see here is you see a man basket on the end of a crane. Look at the picture on the right. Just to the side of the structure that they're working on is another structure that's only about 50 yards away. Well, if I had an articulating bucket truck and I wanted to go to those inside insulators on the side of that pole, I have to be concerned about the other end of my elbow. It's going to be bumping into the pole on the other side. And if you're working in a right-of-way where you're building a new circuit where other circuits already exist, and I put that articulating boom up in the air, the elbow of that boom is going to be over there in that electrical environment, picking up induction or whatever else is in there. That's one of those structural or conditions that we have used as an exception that allows us to use pin-on man baskets. The other one is the conditions of the project. You see that this boom here is at the bottom set of travelers on this structure. That top set of travelers is close to 200 feet up in the air. Well, almost every 35 or 40 ton crane will reach that 200 feet. Bucket trucks would not do that until recently. Most of those bucket trucks would barely reach 160 feet that we have had historically in the industry. But the manufacturers have started to employ some other technologies in their booms. And what they have done is they have adapted the hydraulic telescoping crane boom and incorporated that into an A97 configuration so that now what you have is a telescoping hydraulic boom that is designed to the A92 standard. Now when that happens, now you have an A92 bucket truck designed on a telescoping boom like a crane. The big drawback is that that bucket truck costs about twice as much as the crane costs. So there's a setback right there. And the reason why we've been warning employers that this is coming is to plan ahead and be prepared, because What's going to happen is that as more and more of these 200-foot crane, man baskets or bucket trucks, A92 buckets, are available in the workplace, then the exception is going to go away. Now, I've already talked to OSHA a dozen times over the past 2 years to see what they're hearing and what they're thinking, and right now it's barely in the wind. But we've had a couple of incidents over the past few years that have brought attention to crane man baskets and got OSHA's attention. And the more that happens, and now that we've had a boon in transmission work, we may see more of these incidents, or we might see OSHA looking at crane and pin-on baskets more with that attitude that a crane is for lifting stuff, a bucket is for lifting people, and they may become more and more likely to enforce or object to those exceptions that we talked about earlier. Now, I almost hate to talk about this or write about it because I don't want OSHA to think about it, because I know they read our articles in incident prevention. They see this stuff because I get calls from them asking more about some of that information. But the fact is that what we're trying to do is we are trying to train our people to be prepared for the future of line work and what it holds for us. But keep in mind also that the reason for these standards is very much associated with safety. You know, we're talking about cost, we're talking about the mechanism, we're talking about how we do the work, but there really is a safety value to the A92 standards that make bucket trucks safe to use. So that's really the bottom line, isn't it? Protecting our people. And if we can do it in a safer way, that's good. The more of these we have out there, the price is going to get better. If you have some of the cranes that are now what's called dual rated, both the top manufacturers make dual rated cranes, so it's a 35 or a 40 ton crane that is also rated to be configured as an A92 standard, and it can be used as a crane. If you have one of those cranes that was not dual configured, if that model of crane is available as a dual configured, these manufacturers can retrofit that crane to make it A92 compliant. Now, one other thing I want you to mention, when you do read the standard about lifting personnel, you're going to see a lot of references to this kind of a lift, which is a basket hanging from a cable. OSHA considers them exactly the same. There's no difference between the two. Now, one of the things that has come up in a number of inquiries or debates between OSHA and the employer has to do with the proof test and the trial lift. Now, you can read the rules here, or you can read it in the standard. In the crane standard, if I put a basket on a crane, I have to do a proof test. I load the basket to 125% of the rated load of the basket, and I lift the basket off of the ground, and then I let it sit there for a little bit, and then I shake it, and I check it, and I make sure that the basket is stable and safe to use. Then we do the trial lift. The trial lift, we take the basket and we take it up into the air into all of the working locations to make sure that the basket can safely reach the work that has to be done. Both of these are required by law under the B30 standard for cranes equipped with a basket. The A92 standard does not have that requirement. Now, under the A92 standard, we still have to inspect the basket. We still have to fly the boom. We still have to make sure that the boom and the basket is safe to work out of. But we don't have to do this described proof test and trial lift. So OSHA has cited some employers using an A92 dual rated crane for not doing the proof test. And the question is, if it's a B30 crane, does it require the proof test? So that's still up in the air and is still yet to be decided. OSHA has not addressed it. They haven't addressed it in any of the citations or interpretations, but there's no reason why you can't. But I think you can argue that doing the inspection of an A92 dual rated crane, doing the fly around and doing the inspection of the basket just like you would a bucket truck will probably meet that same standard. We can certainly meet the intention of ensuring that the basket on the boom is safe to use. The other question is about controls operating from the basket. OSHA says this, says if a crane is on the site purely to put a man basket on it to reach the work, that man basket has to have controls in the basket for the operator. Okay, so if it's on site purposely and only to lift a basket with men in it, there has to be a remote operator. So we now have radio controlled remote operators, and you would have one in the basket. If the basket is on site and going to be used both for sometimes a man basket and other times to lift a pole, lift an arm, lift equipment, it's being used for both, then the crane operator can run the basket and no remote operator is required in the basket with the men. So keep that clear. The last thing is, and OSHA has done this also, shows up on a job site with a crane on a basket and ask who is the A&D, sorry, I almost lost it there, the A&D director, assembly, disassembly. When OSHA shows up on a line crew and says, who's the A&D director, nobody knows what they're talking about. Well, in the world of cranes, some cranes are delivered to a job site on a truck, and there may be 2 or 3 trucks, and then another crane is required to assemble that crane. That's assembly and disassembly. The A&D director guides that assembly and uses a certified rigger in order to assemble that crane. Well, OSHA has cited cranes or boom truck cranes, hydraulic telescoping extension with a basket on the end, has cited them for not having an A&D director. But OSHA has also addressed that in the preamble. And here's what OSHA said. A boom truck comes to the job site, it does not have to be assembled. It's ready to go. So there is no assembly. OSHA says that assembly has to do with using a second crane in order to piece together parts of the crane in order to create a working crane. A boom truck arrives on a job site, a 30-ton hydraulic boom truck arrives on a job site ready to go. So it only has to be set up, and OSHA says setup does not require an A&D director. It only requires a competent or qualified person who can be the operator, the same person. And that also applies to swing around jibs. So if you've got a swing around jib that's going to increase the length, that's not considered assembly. That is also considered setup, because after you suck the boom in, as you can see up here on the top left-hand side, the brackets line up with the brackets on the swing around. You drop the pins in, you just rotate it around. It's no different than running the outriggers out and putting them down. So that is also considered setup. So what we're seeing now is we are seeing more and more of these, and these are examples of cranes that come with baskets attached on the basket for the boom that are dual rated buckets, and you're going to see more and more of them are available. And they also reach this distance that we have been concerned about in the past. So the last thing is make sure that your personnel understand these requirements and that they follow these rules. And like I was telling Brent this morning, there are a lot of crane operators who don't understand that that license in your pocket puts very important responsibilities on you. And that is that you are the last person who is going to inspect that piece of equipment before those men or women, line workers, get in that basket and go aloft. Don't shirk that responsibility or think that it's not important. Do those inspections, do the proof lift test, and do the trial lift, and follow through with the rules. If you've done that, nobody can hold you accountable for anything that goes wrong because you've done your job. Now, if you need more information, There is my email address and my phone number. You can send me a text, send me an email if you need more information about compliance. And that includes consulting, training, OSHA compliance, litigation support, the areas that I specialize in. I hope to hear from you, but most of all, I'd love not to ever hear about you. Because that usually means something's gone wrong, and that's when I have to show up, and we don't want to do that. I'd rather be visiting, shaking hands, and saying, good to see you. I sure miss line work. Thank you all.